Welcome back. Today we're diving into something truly fascinating, and we're actually going to approach this explainer a little differently. We aren't just looking at standard history today, we're unpacking a sweeping, dramatic, mythic fable about psychological sovereignty. We're going to examine one of history's most famous figures, but through the incredibly sharp lens of radical philosophy and philology. It's a narrative that completely redefines what it means to possess ultimate inner freedom.
Okay, let's dive into this. How exactly did a solitary free spirit, a man who practiced this majestic, silent indifference to the vulgar power structures of his time, become the very cornerstone of an imperial machinery? That right there is the central paradox of our entire explainer. We're going to contrast the untamed, rebellious nature of our protagonist with the incredibly rigid, oppressive institutions that were eventually built in his name.
To even begin to understand this rebel, you've got to grasp his central radical philosophy. The sources highlight that he wasn't preaching some system of guilt, punishment, or reward in a distant afterlife. No, he proclaimed a radical alternative. Quote, "The kingdom of heaven is an immediate, internal state of the heart." Think about that. He shifted the focus entirely away from external validation and cosmic futures, placing it directly into your present reality, right into the individual's inner life. Section 1. Establishing the lore, the four portraits. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how we can efficiently synthesize the traditional historical accounts of his life before we apply our philosophical lens. The ancient texts give us four distinct yet complementary portraits. Matthew presents the promised king from the royal line of David, descending to the valley not with an iron scepter, but to deliver a radical new law of grace. Mark gives us the fast-paced action of a suffering servant, moving with urgent power in a ransom-paying act of service. Luke offers the compassionate Savior, reaching out to outcasts and the marginalized. And John stands totally apart with profound theological reflection, introducing the eternal Logos.
And it's exactly in John's Gospel where we hit this massive textual anchor, I am. It's incredibly dramatic. Our sources point out that John bypasses traditional parables to focus on these sweeping, mystical discourses. By making these profound, absolute statements, this narrative literally turns the water of everyday ritual into the rich wine of faith, establishing a sovereign, divine identity.
Section 2. The imperial machinery. Now, every great fable needs an antagonist, right? Enter the imperial machinery. On one side, we have this rigid, oppressive world, the heavy Roman influence on regional politics, their iron-fisted occupation, and the dry, life-denying scholasticism of the religious authorities. It was a world entirely based on transactional power. But on the exact opposite side, you have the sovereign spirit, a traveler walking through those rigid walls carrying immense psychological altitude, overflowing spiritual abundance, and an untouchable internal kingdom. It's a fundamental clash between societal dogma and pure individual sovereignty. Section 3. The Holy Anarchist. Our sources reframe this protagonist not merely as a cosmic redeemer, but as a holy anarchist. What does that mean, exactly? It describes a sovereign spirit who practices a radical philology of existence. Basically, he's a master of language and symbol who totally shatters literalism. He treats life itself as a sign of heavenly glory, rather than some miserable ledger of guilt. The crucial point here is that this figure stood in silent, powerful defiance to the dry dogma of the Pharisees and the Romans, anchoring his soul entirely in the unmediated, direct experience of the divine. You really see this in action when he declares, "But I say unto you." I mean, the sheer audacity of that is revolutionary. In the context of ancient, unbending laws, it shows a man who looked at the rigid morality of his culture and instinctively created his own values. He was rewriting ancient laws, not from a place of political ambition, but from a place of profound, untouchable spiritual freedom. Which brings us to a fascinating philosophical archetype presented in the text, the Proto-Übermensch. This describes a rare, noble spirit who lives his own truth beyond good and evil, operating with the aristocratic privilege of true non-resistance. Turning the other cheek wasn't a sign of weakness for him. It was an unshakable inner abundance. He simply refused to be dragged into the petty squabbles and the reactive resentment of lesser men. And this absolute internal sovereignty culminates right here. When he faces the cross, he doesn't frantically defend himself. He offers only a serene silence. As our sources emphasize, this was not a moment of defeat or mere physical suffering. It was the supreme demonstration of how one ought to live. It was the ultimate proof that his internal freedom was entirely untouchable by worldly corruption or violence. Section 4. The tragedy of the herd. But history, as we all know, rarely lets a sovereign spirit remain untamed. So, how does a prophet of a higher state of being become a tool for the mediocre? It's a recurring, tragic theme in human history. A radical movement is born from profound freedom, only for institutions to step in, co-opt it, and weaponize it to control the masses. And this brilliantly illustrates Friedrich Nietzsche's concept of slave morality. According to this view, the early architects of the church, the priests and theologians, took his aristocratic nobility and completely inverted it into a religion of pity. They engineered a resentment-driven system that weaponizes weakness, punishes strength, and ultimately declares war on life itself. The text outlines the actual mechanics of this historical inversion in 3 logical steps. First, the herd mentality entirely misunderstands this rare noble spirit. Second, they corrupt his magnificent legacy of immediate inner abundance into a transactional system of guilt, punishment, and distant afterlife rewards. And finally, they use this new dogma to tame the human animal and shackle the human will to power. They transformed a solitary free spirit into an institutional idol. Which leads us to this incredibly heavy conclusion, the ultimate tragedy. Our sources state that they crucified his actual spirit long before the Romans ever nailed his flesh to the wood. The very savior who lived to demonstrate untouched internal freedom was used to build the exact same imperial machinery of the soul that he died to resist. Let's move to and see how this builds. Section 5, Path to Internal Liberation. So, what does this fable of psychological sovereignty mean for your daily life? The sources invite us to contrast the herd mentality with inner freedom. The herd mentality is all around us today, isn't it? Transactional modern politics, dry societal dogmas, everyone constantly seeking distant or external rewards. But the philosophy of inner freedom challenges you to cultivate non-defensive love, to maintain a high psychological altitude, and to live in immediate spiritual abundance. We have to look at our modern structures and ask, are we just cogs in the machinery, or are we maintaining an untouchable internal kingdom? According to this framework, the key takeaway for your own life is that true non-resistance comes from overflowing spiritual abundance, not weakness. When you refuse to engage with the reactive resentment of the modern mob, or when you meet hostility with serene silence, you are not surrendering. You are demonstrating that your mind inhabits a psychological altitude far, far above the petty squabbles of the world. So I want to leave you with this final provocative thought. We live in a world absolutely saturated with rigid dogma, outrage, and institutional machinery. In the face of all that, are you cultivating your own internal kingdom? Are you letting the world build its walls inside your mind, or are you living as a sovereign spirit? Think about that long after this explainer ends. Thanks so much for joining me on this deep dive, and I'll catch you next time.